Glad you're watching Outnumbered. New questions today about whether the GOP candidates will be able to maintain their standing in those traditionally important early voting states. And right now, Senator Ted Cruz holds a pretty comfortable lead in the real clear political average in Iowa, with around 30%. Donald Trump trailing behind him, 26%, followed by Senator Marco Rubio, Dr. Ben Carson, and Jeb Bush. But it's a very different story in New Hampshire, where Trump remains the frontrunner, 28%. Cruz and Rubio both come in at 12%, with Governor Chris Christie and Jeb Bush rounding out the top 5. Things also looking good for Trump in South Carolina, where he has nearly 34% of the vote. Cruz, Rubio, and Carson take 2, 3, and 4 spots. Jeb Bush at 5th. At 7%. So I come out to you. You've worked on many campaigns.
Absolutely.
We effectively call you, or affectionately call you, Hobnob.
That's correct.
You've been around,
I accept
my friend.
and love the name.
What do you make of where Trump is? Where does he need to win? Or is it even about that, really, with him? Because he's been out front for so long.
Look, we for so long have been minimizing and trivializing Donald Trump's performance in these polls. And while I always put out the caveat that you really shouldn't make too much of polls, especially at an early stage, it's not that early a stage anymore. So I think we have to acknowledge fairly that Donald Trump is going to be a force of nature in these primaries. I will say, however, that the greatest gravitational force in politics is momentum. And if Ted Cruz wins that Iowa caucus, I think there's a reshuffling of a lot of these poll numbers, especially in South Carolina, where you are going to have more of a conservative electorate. And I've always suggested that Trump's real opposition to the Republican Party is not the establishment. It's not John Kasich. It's not Jeb Bush. It's not Chris Christie. It's from the conservative wing of the party, and that standard bearer right now, most effectively, is Senator Ted Cruz.
You know, Kat, I want to come to you just on where you think the momentum is coming from for Ted Cruz.
I think he's getting some of Ben Carson's support, probably. And I think that Iowa always made sense for Ted Cruz. Santorum won last time around. Religion and faith is more important to them than a lot of other things in a lot of other places. So it makes sense that they wouldn't support Donald Trump overall. But again, with polls, what I always say is that I bet you he has even more support than people are willing to admit, because a lot of people might not want to admit they like Donald Trump, but secretly they're on Twitter going all nuts for him.
Yeah, Andrea, I've heard you say that very thing many times. You've said that Donald Trump is like the joke in the room that nobody wants to tell the punchline to.
Oh, yeah. It's like an inappropriate joke. I mean, you look over both shoulders before you say, I kind of like that.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what I hear people doing. And so, yeah, I do think the polling's a lot higher for Trump. I want to yield some of my time to Hobnob, because we used to work on campaigns together. That's where you got the nickname. And I want you to break down a couple scenarios.
Yeah.
So we saw, Lindsey Graham drop out of the race today. I'd love your thoughts on where his 0.0067% goes. If the others drop out, break that down for us, too. And also walk us through a scenario where if Ted Cruz takes Iowa, I don't see him taking New Hampshire. It doesn't seem suited for him. That seems suited more for a Trump.
The numbers don't support it now.
They don't, and they won't. The demographics
tight,
just aren't
like
in his favor. It's not a state that really plays to that area of the Republican Party. Break that down. Then what happens after that?
Well, look, Donald Trump, without a doubt, has sincere support in New Hampshire, which likes to kind of, as a primary group, they have quirky behavior sometimes. They don't go for that standard bearer of the Republican Party. And I've talked to many people on the ground who actually think that Donald Trump's organization on the ground is very strong in New Hampshire. His campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, used to be a big grassroots activist. Where else? In New Hampshire. So that's definitely Trump's firewall if he loses Iowa. And then he goes into South Carolina on much stronger footing to take on Ted Cruz. Now, Ted Cruz's other advantage, however, is March 1st is what we affectionately call the SEC primary. Most of the southeastern states are all going to hold their primary on the same day. Trump and Cruz have a very similar dynamic as they do in South Carolina in those states. So if they both go into this with serious momentum, you could really begin to see the end of the bromance, because they're going to have to start engaging each other directly. Meanwhile, I'll only say this real quick. I think the person who is kind of slow and steady here is Marco Rubio. He's not done enough to cement himself in the kind of second place spot in any of these polls. We see that he's always tied somewhere with Ted Cruz. But his candidacy is, I think, the fail-safe for the establishment if they feel that Cruz or Trump are going to go too far along.
Which is why Jeb Bush should drop out of the race, so that those establishment donors can go to someone who is actually a viable candidate.
I like where your head's at, Pavlich.
And what about Dr. Ben Carson, though? Because I could almost see a split in South Carolina. I mean, if he doesn't go away, he still has that component of evangelical voters that have not drifted yet away from him.
I think that's probably true. But I think Ben Carson has really been hurt by his especially in the last debate, his explanation of how he would really handle foreign policy and terrorism when it's the #1 issue for voters.
And he's just canceled that trip to Africa and Israel, so he's probably not going to get any more on-the-ground experience.
Right, exactly. Well, moving on to something less important.